Good night, Mrs. Goggins.
Good night. Good night. My favourite combat now. Hilda, you fat cow, get your ass out of bed. I'm getting the weapon. Oh. Hilda! Where's Hilda's room on here? The main office. The kitchen.
Ooh, suave young blank.
You look about right.
Goggins, take me with you.
I'll be back for you, love.
Okay.
Hilda, get your gear on. We're escaping. Here.
Oh, what are you doing?
Have this, Hilda.
Excuse me, I don't need one of these. Oh, okay, maybe I do.
Let's get this party started.
I'm ready. Army eye.
Oh yeah.
Are you ready?
Go, Hilda, go. Go your back, love. Go on.
Okay.
This is the plan, Hilda.
Hold on. Where's me gun?
Shut up, you silly potato. The nannies are asleep.
But I think I've left it over there. I'm just gonna
Hilda!
go
Shut
and
up,
get
I
it.
can hear someone. Hilda! Hilda, watch out!
Oh, thank you, love.
I can hear someone coming.
Take that.
Grenade!
It's grenade, you daft bitch.
Ah! You almost landed on me, you fat cow.
Shut up, you saggy old fart.
Can't be a fat, you dumb bitch.
Shut up and get your head down. Okay, enough. Let's take care of these queef sniffing, ass wiping, low life losers.
Okie dokie, sexy.
Just stop. Goggins, help me.
Haggis, no!
Ow, it's...
I'll come back for you, okay?
But you said that already.
I did?
Yeah.
Ah well, here, take this, love.
What was that?
It's a sleeping pill.
It's not working.
Sweet dreams, darling.
Will she be okay?
I don't see why not. Come on. There's someone in there.
No shit.
3,
What are you doing?
2,
Goggins.
1. Oh, slowly does it.
I'm sorry, Mum, but I'm gonna have to ask you to stay where you are.
Me back's locked up. I'm
I can fall for that one later.
No, seriously, it has. Care to help a young woman up? Thanks, love. Come on, Hilda.
Man down, man down. Oh,
You're a woman, love.
I'm losing a lot of blood, and that's my excuse. I'm sticking to it. Forget Alzheimer's.
Will you be okay?
Yeah, just go on without. Yeah. I'm ready.
Action. Grenade!
Grenade, you daft bitch!
Eh? 3. Hilda, I found your room.
Hold on, where's we going?
Hilda, shut up. You're gonna wake the nannies up, you silly cow. Bye, Haggis.
Ow! On and go.
I just broke it.
I thought you were going to hit the door.